Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's Community Archives lecture. We'll be looking at tension and debate. So here are weekly topics for this week. What are the sources of tension and debate within communities? How can community archives address tension and debate within a community? And what do community members want to see in community archives? So a key source of tension and debate within communities that can translate into the formation and operation of a community archive is the different um, amalgamations of identity within the community itself. And the Gabiola article for this week comments on the concept and function of a community being complicated by intersecting identities, cultural values, intergenerational differences, pursuit of economic advancement and social mobility, politics, competing goals, and evolution. So you can see how people with different experiences, different values, different political views, different ages, different sexualities, can all sort of create friction with other people who may be in the same community, at least superficially, but may have very different experiences and memories and desires based on the identity characteristics that they possess. The Rodriguez article for this week talks about Teresita and how she was making claims to important truths about her life and extensive queer, transgender, Latina life in the second half of the 20th century. And so you can really see connections between just this one individual and a lot of different identities. So identifying as someone who is transgender but is also Latina and has AIDS as well. So it's really kind of unrealistic to expect that the identity within a community is going to be this kind of flat sort of homogenous collection, right? When in fact, we each have different characteristics about ourselves. We each view ourselves in different ways, and that is going to translate into how people view their community and how in turn they might view a potential community archive that comes to represent a community. So again, just to emphasize the complexity of identity, here are two, I guess, diagrams, if you want to call them that the University of Michigan developed. One showing different aspects of social identity and different aspects of personal identity. So within a community, you might have people who, you could pick 10 people and they all might have different things in, all or a majority of these different sections. And then you compound that on personal differences that people might have, which can be sort of influential in how a person views themselves and their community as well. Maybe not as influential as a person's social identity and how they view their social identity. Your favorite music probably isn't going to impact how you view yourself and how you view the outside world as much as your gender or your sexual orientation. But it is an aspect of a person's identity, which can cause people to experience things in different ways and think and feel in different ways. And when it comes to the creation of a community archive when it comes to making decisions about what might be best for the community or how to see the community thrive. That can, these differences and these complex identities can cause a lot of disagreements to occur. And of course, that's not necessarily inevitable. So obviously, people that may have slightly different social or personal identities can still get along if they feel like sort of the value that they're getting out of the community archive or working with within their community overwhelms whatever sort of misgivings they have about maybe slightly being misrepresented or feeling like your experience isn't necessarily at the forefront of a community's actions or a community's memory projects. And it's also important to think of how in communities that are maybe more homogenous, then there might not be as many differences within these different categories. And, you might take 10 different people and, maybe 7 or 8 of them would have pretty strong overlaps between a lot of these different modifiers. And that typically is going to result in less tension and debate because they're going to share more of a sense of identity, more of a sense of connection to each other, and that may result in less sort of discussions about what the community is, how the community should be represented, and things of that nature. But it's always interesting to look at the different ways that people might define themselves and think about how that sort of can impact how a person, views themselves, views their community, and views how their community should be represented within society as a whole. And that really ties in with this idea of subgroups within a community that, again, are going to kind of interact with each other and bounce off of each other and possibly have friction between each other. And it may be that different subgroups within a community either have just enough in common to consider themselves part of a community. They may have just enough disagreements to really inflame some of these different tensions and debates within a community. It's just going to depend on the composition of different individuals within different subgroups of communities and sort of how they view themselves in relation to other groups of people within a community. And I don't mean subgroup in like in an inferior way, just like a subdivision of a community. And there can especially be a lot of tensions created when one subgroup within a community is dominating discussions about the shape of the community or the shape of a community archive and the story that it tells. And this goes back to this idea of meta-narratives. And if one subgroup is creating a lot of the sort of representations of a community, then that may result in a meta-narrative about that community that doesn't really resonate with other subgroups within a community. And as a result, other subgroups might start to feel threatened and marginalized even within their own community or within their own community archive. And that can certainly be something that can create a lot of tension and debate. If sort of one of these groups within a community is kind of dictating a lot of what goes on, how the community is represented in the archive and the public, then these other subgroups can start to grow kind of more and more agitated, and that can result in confrontation and a lot of debate over exactly how the community should be represented. And it's interesting to think of this connection between memory and identity. So how you identify can really have a strong impact on how you remember things that might have happened to you in the past, and it may cause different people in a community or different groups within a community to recall events differently. So again, the Ramirez article talks about how some of the different experiences of members of the LGBTQ plus community during the AIDS crisis, and how they sort of viewed the AIDS crisis differently based on their sexuality. And that led to different identities within that community being shaped in specific ways. So sort of how you identify as a person can be shaped by memory, but also I think it can shape the memories that you have. And that may lead to you or other people within a community that maybe have more shared identity characteristics with you to recall events maybe differently, or to feel like you're a part of the community, experience things differently than other parts of your community did, and that in turn may lead you to feel like the community itself should be represented in a particular way. And so all these different identities and subgroups within a community can go a long way towards shaping the exterior identity of the community itself. And that's something that the Kaplan article for this week really focused on a lot. So in that article, Jews in America were really focused on creating an exterior identity in the form of a the historical society controlled by the community members themselves. And in order to do that, they had to navigate a pretty diverse set of identities within the American Jewish community. So, people who were strongly Zionist, people who were anti-Zionist, people who were more religious, so rabbis, versus people who maybe weren't as religious, Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazi Jews. And all of these different identities sort of bounced off each other and were eventually, amalgamated into this exterior identity that the American Jewish Historical Society decided was the best one to fit the needs of American Jews at the time. So one more focused on conformity and patriotism, and one that was really meant to stave off external detractors and people in American society who, had problems with immigrants in America, had problems with people who were Jewish, and this exterior identity was seemingly very calculated to not rock the boat and to portray an external identity of American Jews that was very kind of conformist and non-threatening. But again, this was a result of a lot of discussion and debate and friction between different aspects of Jewish society, kind of being, in some cases, accepted and highlighted within the Historical Society, and in some cases being sort of shorn off because they didn't really fit with the exterior identity that at least a certain section of American Jewish society wanted to use to represent American Jews to people outside of the community. And again, it's important to note that the American Jewish Historical Society was formed during the time of crisis. There was a time where, Jews in America really felt like external conditions and needs were at a crisis point, and that they needed to have some way to demonstrate the ability of Jewish people in America to assimilate to American culture. So again, they were responding to a crisis of xenophobia, a crisis of discrimination, and also an interior crisis. So the Kaplan article talks about the struggle by Jewish people in America to sort of understand what does it mean to be a Jew in America, where you're free from a lot of the sort of traditions and conventions that were a very well defined part of Jewish society in Europe. So kind of dual crises of internal and external threats that American Jews were facing, and that is really reflected in the exterior identity that they created. And so you can see here our diagram for community archive formation. So, there is some shared identity, some shared experiences among American Jews. Again, a lot of different identities and experiences kind of going into that, but there was a sense of American Jews as being a community. And then there was, these triggers, especially a sense of marginalization, a fear that that Jewish people were at risk of persecution, and a desire to represent themselves through the creation of a community archive or a historical society that worked to lessen the sense of threat and the sense of danger that Jews in America felt in the 1890s. And there are several stages within a community archive that these tensions can crop up. So participation is a big one. So who gets to create the narrative of a community? Who participates in sharing community memories? A pretty fundamental part of community archives, as we've talked about, is participation. And so, the question is who gets to participate, or who is encouraged to participate? Is it just one subgroup within a community? Is it the whole community? Is one aspect of the community maybe punching above its weight and making more decisions about a community archive than other groups within a community? And that can create a lot of questions. And then that's tied into which aspects of the community are creating narratives about the community, which parts of the community are sharing the narrative about a community, and how is that shaping the overall perspective of a community itself. And again, a lot of these tensions can be exacerbated within communities facing strong internal and external pressure. So sort of a fight or flight response might come into place, and questions over participation and what narratives is created and how that narrative is shared and what the ultimate perspective of the community is can really be heightened. I mean, if you feel like your community's, physical health might be threatened, which is oftentimes sort of a precursor for the creation of community archives, then that can really heighten a lot of these debates within a community, and the myriad identities within a community can exacerbate, again, questions over participation and sort of what perspective of the community is presented to the public. Another big source of tension and debate within a community, especially, again, when it comes to the creation of community archives, is the question of focus. So exactly what is the community archive going to focus on, and how is that going to shape the narrative and perspective of a community that the community itself and the outside public works with and interacts with. So for instance, the Kaplan article talks about the debate over should we just collect historical materials or should we go ahead and publish them, and some of the debate over which of those should be the focus of the historical society. There was a real desire to focus on the connections to early immigration and immigrants among members of the Jewish community, and that certainly didn't represent the experiences or identities of every American Jew at the time. So that was a source of discussion. So more specifically, there was a desire to connect to Sephardic Jews. They were thought of as being some of the early colonizers of America. And this is despite major differences between Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews, who were more European-centered and weren't as celebrated as being involved in early American history as Sephardic Jews were. And then I touched on the whole Zionism versus anti-Zionism debate, a question over whether or not the historical societies should focus on anti-Semitism and socialism, which were two strong parts of the Jewish community at the time. Was there a desire to focus on secularism as opposed to the religious aspects of Judaism? And again, all these different questions about focus play into exactly what kind of narrative about a community is going to be represented within a community archive and shared with the public. And so it's interesting to think of how focus is connected to the intended audience. Is the purpose of your historical society just to appease outsiders and make them feel that your community isn't a threat to the greater good, or is your intended audience people on the inside of your community, and how does that impact what you decide to focus on? And that's certainly something the Kaplan article touches on quite a bit. And if you look at a few of the different things that community archives and really archives of all stripes do, you can see that there are a lot of room for attention and debate as well. So, what is collected by the community? So what is the geographic scope of materials collected? Which historical period is documented? The Kaplan article talks about deciding which denominations should or should not be represented in the materials collected. Again, this idea of should we focus on collecting historical materials or collecting and publishing? How things are preserved, that can be a question that differs between members of a community as well. How do you compile all this information and make it available? Should you publish it or should you not publish it? And again, a lot of these decisions by a community can be focused on questions of who does or doesn't belong in it. And they can be based on the feelings of exclusion by a person with a particular identity. So for instance, the Ramirez article talks about how one activist had connections with white gay activists, and Teresita felt like that disqualified him as a representative of the Latinx community, simply because of this individual's interactions with people outside of the community. So again, who gets to participate in making determinations about what the focus of a community archive should be? And then I think you could add, as another source of potential tension, activation and activism. So should a community be involved with being more activists and advocating for changes in society, or should the community be more sort of passive and not wanting to rock the boat as much as they may otherwise? And again, I think you can trace this back to the reasons for why the community archive was created, the sort of internal or external threats the community feels, and that's going to shape a lot of the decisions about a community's actions in a community archive and exactly how community archiving is carried out by a community. Another source of tension and debate within a community as it relates to a community archive might be the geographic location of a community archive. So if certain members of a community feel like a place within a city or a state or a neighborhood has more of a connection to their identity or their memories, then they may feel like that's where the community archive should be, that that's the part of a geographic location that is really the heart of a community, or represents the experiences of a community in an important way. And of course, other people who have other identities within a community, or maybe have other memories within a community based on their experiences and their identities, may feel like there is another part of a city or a neighborhood that is more representative of the community and of the community's history. And that's certainly something that can cause some tension and debate. If you're saying this is the community's memories, then community members may have a lot of investment in exactly where those memories are physically located, or where the representation of those memories can be found. So obviously you could say just put it online, don't have a physical location, and there are certainly some benefits to that. But when you put something online, you sort of lose some of the connections with place and with sort of a feeling of tangentiality or meaningfulness that you have with a specific space located within a specific part of a neighborhood or a city that community members can call their own. So, obviously it might be less expensive to just have a community archive online, but you do lose some of that sort of sense of belonging within a geographic location. But attached to that sense of belonging can be some arguments and disagreements over exactly where that physical manifestation of a community should be found. Another big source of debate within communities when it comes to community archives can be potential partnerships between a community archive and a mainstream archives, or partnerships between community members and the community archive itself. The Ramirez article expresses some distaste towards institutional archives. So the author talks about, rather than spending valuable research time and that also revered educational institution of UC Berkeley, or in queer regional archives that lacked racial ethnic specificity, archival work on both spaces that I already knew would prove fruitless in terms of queer Latino anything. I instead spent time walking, talking, waiting, and making and returning calls to the living archives of desire around me. So it may be that community members just don't want to interact or work with even more regional or more community-centric archives if they don't feel like they're really going to see themselves reflected within an institution. And that's pretty understandable, right? If you see an archive that is supposed to represent you and you don't really find any resonance of your identity within that archive, then you may feel like, okay, well, what's the point? And you're probably going to feel pretty reluctant to have any interaction with that archive. And so that can certainly dissuade community members from, again, working with a community archive, partnering with a community archive, participating in a community archive, and that's certainly true for mainstream archives as well. And it may be that community members don't want to partner with community archives or work with community archives or mainstream archives because they feel like that's the power that they have to wield. And this is something that the Gabiola article touches on, this idea of representational subversion, in which minoritized identities contribute to the erasure of their voices. So they use their power to honor wishes, sacrifices, struggles, cultural values to protect the communities they care about. So saying, we're going to honor what we perceive to be the wishes and cultural values of our community by not sharing our experiences and not sharing with our voices with even community archives, and probably especially mainstream archives. And people may not share their experiences and their memories, but the Gabiola article mentions that they may actually encourage other community members to do the same. So having a dialogue within a community which is really against this idea of participation or partnership within community and mainstream archives. So there really can be this tension between the desire to increase the visibility of the community and make more people aware of sort of the identity of the community and the community's history and struggles and things of that nature, versus a desire to have control and a desire to have some power over how the community's narrative is shaped. And again, if you feel like you would potentially be working with community or mainstream archives that don't really seem to have much interest in representing your community or your community's stories, then that tension might be increased. And you may feel like, well, we're not really going to have any control because we feel like we're being kind of marginalized within this archive, at least historically. So that makes us kind of hesitant to have any kind of relationship with an archive. And we'll talk more about partnerships between community members and community archives and mainstream archives later on in this semester. So we'll revisit this idea of partnerships, but you can definitely see how there might be a lot of discussion and dialogue and tension within a community over exactly what the relationship between the community and archives of any stripe might be. So how can community archives go about addressing tension and debate within a community? Again, I think a key area of focus should be participation. So having broad and deep participation within community archives by community members can create a space for conversations within the community to occur. And, you know, that's really one of the key things that a community archive can be, is just a place where community members who may have different experiences, may have different identities, can get together and sort of share their experiences with each other, and start to develop this sense of community and representational belonging that can be possible when you realize, hey, there are other people who have maybe experienced things similar to me, maybe not completely similar, but in some ways, and that makes me feel sort of more safe and secure in my identity, and maybe makes me feel more comfortable thinking about engaging in activism or taking other steps to help my community regain power and resist marginalization. And it's certainly true that participation can also create more tension in debate. You know, it can cause some of these different conflagrations between members of a community to occur. But I think if community archives sort of ignore this and don't try and acknowledge this and document these areas of disagreement and this tension and debate, then they really aren't engaging in the community-centric archiving that Jillian advocates for. So if they sort of ignore the different conflicts and contradictions within a community, then they're not really providing an environment in which community records and materials are understood and valued in their originating context. Community archives are not creating a situation in which the community's complexity and flux is being sort of recognized and honored and brought to bear on archival practice. So it might be painful to have some of these discussions. It might result in the community, working against itself in some ways. But ultimately, if you want to represent a community completely, and you want to serve as a space where some of these arguments can maybe be resolved in order for the community to work together more thoroughly in the future, then these kinds of discussions are important to have. And the Kaplan article talks about how there were a lot of meeting minutes that document the discussion over the form of the community archive. And again, those really demonstrate the complexity of the community and the competing perspectives that went on, and represented a much more realistic portrayal of what the Jewish community in America was like in the 1890s. Of course, the Kaplan article also notes that those minutes were censored from the official record. But still, there is some evidence of these internal discussions and these sources of tension and debate, and they do portray a more nuanced image of the American Jewish community at the time than is maybe the one that a person might understand from the historical society that came out of those discussions. So it may be true that not every community wants their complexity and flux documented. They may just want sort of a unified, coherent picture of the community to emerge. And as a community archivist, you have to be sort of cognizant of that fact and recognize it. But if you want to represent your community in an accurate and meaningful way, then documenting these areas of disagreement can really go a long way towards doing that. So what do community members want to see in community archives? I think that it all goes back to this idea of representational belonging. So a desire to see a meaningful representation of their perception of their community and how they fit into it, as well as how they fit into society at large. And obviously this can be a difficult thing, with the different identities and groups within a community. It can be difficult to sort of be all things to all people as a community archives, and to provide this sense of representational belonging to every single member of a person who may consider themselves to be a part of the community that a community archive is documenting. So that really speaks to some of the challenges that community archives have, is to, again, try and be all things to all people, and to not have members of a community feel like they are being marginalized and disempowered again. It's probably inevitable that that's going to be the case, but it certainly is something that community archives can strive for as they are organizing and operating their community archive. And you can see some of the examples of this desire for representational belonging found in the Ramirez article, which has just so many examples of really great, engaging writing. But in this excerpt here, the author is talking about Teresita and how she connected to those who had come with her and were no longer by her side, with those from recent generations who she felt must understand what came before them. So this idea of a desire for community members to have this sort of sense of history and this sense of intergenerational dialogue. So this sense of we were here, we have had a long history here, and allowing community members to serve as representations of this history and this meaningful presence within a community for generations. So thinking of these testimonials as critical acts of documentation that do demonstrate this this intergenerational history and this intergenerational dialogue. I touched on this excerpt earlier, but where Ramirez talks about, I instead spent time walking, talking, waiting, and making and returning calls to the living archives of desire around me. I really connect this with this idea of I am here and we belong here. So this sense of just being infused with community memory and identity and having this visceral connection with a sense of belonging. You know, it's just such powerful writing to feel like you have this sort of living archive around you. And if community archives can provide that, you know, as much as possible, then that's definitely something that can support a community's sense of representational belonging. This section focuses on archival traces, where we have been historically and why we may be where we are at today. So focusing on this idea of we were here, sort of what is the history of our community that survived, and how do they detail the conditions that our community faces right now? How do records help us understand, you know, what our lives are like today, and how can we be courageous enough to really understand and see what those records say and what those records mean. So you can definitely connect those to the sense of representational belonging as well. So when you look at archival traces in history, we were here looking at how that connects to the present, a sense of we belong here. I am here, sort of what is my shape, or what is my place within the shape of the living archives that these records embody. Again, such eloquent writing and things that you can connect to the sense of representational belonging that ideally community archives support the creation of. And finally, this last excerpt, which talks about, again, the lack of a repository for queer Latino archives in the region, and kind of the scattered and unorganized nature of community records. You know, obviously this is something that can detract from a person's sense of representational belonging. And one of the key things that community archives can do is they can serve as sort of a centralized location or a centralized resource where all these different scattered artifacts and records can be brought under community control, made available to community members, and can support this sense of representational belonging, this sense of history, this sense of identity, this sense of belonging within society. So that's certainly an act that community archives can be closely engaged with, and one that can really have a lot of benefits for the community being documented. Okay, so we'll go ahead and close things there. You know, tension and debates within a community are kind of inevitable, but rather than just kind of saying, well, you know, all these identities are too complex for us to ever weave together, it's good for community archives to work with community members and try and at least come to some kind of agreement over what the community archive might look like, to have participation in those discussions as broad and deep as possible, to encourage community members to feel a sense of partnership and connection to community archives. And hopefully, if all those things occur, then it will be possible for the community archive to serve as a source of representational belonging for a community, and not something that serves to inflame and disintegrate a community even more than a community might already be, you know, sort of stretched apart by by decades of marginalization and struggle and uncertainty. Okay, as always, let me know if you have any questions. Have a great week, have a great day, and I will talk to you soon.